Welcome to this lecture series on Environment and Ecology presented by Mentors for IS in association with Bangalore IS Academy and Nama KPSC. So in this particular video, we'll be discussing about the last function of an ecosystem, that is homeostasis. So we have already completed our discussion with respect to the other three functions of an ecosystem in the previous videos, and in this particular video we'll be completing homeostasis. Now, depending upon the book or the source that you're going to use to read and understand about the functions of an ecosystem, it is possible that homeostasis is not included as a function of an ecosystem, because in many situations it is actually debatable if homeostasis can be considered to be as a function of an ecosystem. But we will not go into that aspect, but we will just try to understand the entire concept of an ecosystem's function, that is homeostasis, in this particular video. So what I'll be doing is that before moving on ahead to just explain the function of an ecosystem when it comes to homeostasis, it would actually be better if we understand what is this homeostasis. So in order to understand what is this homeostasis, it would actually be beneficial for us to take the human system, the human body itself, as an example. So generally, I'm pretty sure you'd have heard of homeostasis. This homeostasis actually refers to any self-regulating process by which an organism tends to maintain stability while adjusting to conditions that are best for its survival. So as it says here, homeostasis is the maintenance of a stable equilibrium, especially through physiological processes. Now, for me to explain it to you, the best example is always with respect to the body's ability to maintain and regulate its temperature. But before I actually go ahead with this, I just wanted to understand this particular concept as well, which says that organisms try to maintain the constancy of its internal environment despite varying external environmental conditions that tend to upset its homeostasis. Now, this you should be able to understand very clearly, and the other important thing I want you to remember is that it also includes something known as negative feedback loops. So I'll explain what these things are actually about. Okay, so try to relate my explanation with respect to this diagram over here. Okay, so again, the best example would always be the body's ability to maintain and regulate its temperature. So normally, your body's temperature should be around 37 degrees Celsius. That is the normal body temperature, that is 37 degree Celsius. Now, this is necessary for many reasons, like maintaining concentration of various ions in the blood, to maintain the pH level. The stomach maintains the pH level, concentration of glucose, etc., etc. But now my question is, what is the temperature of your surrounding environment? What is the temperature of your surrounding environment? Is it always 37 degrees Celsius? Of course not. It could be below 10 degrees Celsius in winter, and it could also be above 40 degrees Celsius in summer. Then, don't you think the body's temperature should also change and vary accordingly with respect to the season? Yes, right? Obviously it should. But what happens is that the body's temperature will always remain the same, or at least very close to 37 degrees Celsius range. And this is because the body regulates the temperature through something known as negative feedback loops. I've already explained what is a negative feedback loop. Or even if you're not able to relate to this change in temperature, I'm pretty sure whenever you try to exercise, the body actually generates heat. That is why you try to breathe in more heavily and breathe out more heavily, because since the body's temperature increases, you have to regulate the temperature, and when you breathe heavily, you are able to ensure that more heat is actually lost when you breathe out heavily. That is what is happening. And when you breathe in, you're also taking in a lot of oxygen. So I'll just try to explain what do you mean by negative feedback loops. See, first of all, you have to consider a feedback loop. You have to consider a feedback loop. Now, a feedback loop is like an alarm system in your body that will trigger a certain result. So you can have a positive feedback, you can also have a negative feedback. A positive feedback always tries to amplify something, whereas a negative feedback always tries to inhibit something. For example, if you consider positive feedback, say for example, a person is injured. Now, if that person is injured and if there is a cut on the body, then obviously that person will start to bleed. Now, what will happen is that the body will release certain chemicals to activate platelets in the blood for clotting. Once activated, the platelets will release more chemicals to activate more platelets. Hence, blood clotting. This is positive feedback. That is always trying to increase something. It is always trying to increase something. However, when it comes to homeostasis, it involves negative feedback. For example, when the body temperature increases. Now you can consider this particular diagram over here. Okay, so when the body's temperature increases, the brain sends signals to the sweat glands because we have to reduce the temperature increase. We have to reduce the temperature increase, and therefore we will start to sweat and the body temperature will eventually be reduced because we start losing heat to the outside environment. But the problem is that if this continues, then the body will start to cool down further. If we don't stop this process of reducing this temperature increase, then what will happen is that body may also start to cool down further to such a level which is not suitable. Now what will happen is that the brain will once again send a signal to stop the cooling process. It will still start to send signals to stop the cooling process. Hence, there is a process to prevent increase in any direction, that is either increase in temperature or fall in temperature. So what can happen? The blood vessels may constrict so that heat is conserved. The sweat glands will not secrete any more fluids, meaning you will not sweat anymore. Therefore, the loss of heat is prevented and heat is retained in the body. So I hope you're able to understand the difference between a negative feedback and a positive feedback. See, in negative feedback, it always provides for self-regulation, unlike positive feedback, which always tries to increase something. Positive feedback tries to increase something, whereas negative feedback tries to inhibit. I'm not saying only decrease, I'm saying it tries to inhibit something. So in this case, it is inhibiting increase in body temperature, or it could be inhibiting fall in temperature. See, still if this particular concept is not very clear, try to take a factory for example. Now see, obviously if you're considering positive feedback which always tries to increase something, then I could say that more the factory produces goods, more should be the profit. But at the same time, if you consider negative feedback will try to regulate production. It will not simply try to increase the production of goods. Negative feedback will say that if you continuously increase the number of goods, I may not have enough storage space. Therefore, this could also lead to damage to goods, and therefore I have to bring down the production rate. At the same time, if the production rate comes down to such a level that we are not able to make profit, then we have to increase the production level. So negative feedback provides for this self-regulation. So it inhibits loss. At the same time, it is inhibiting the production rate to come down to such a level that we are not able to earn any profit. This is the reason we always say that we need a negative feedback loop which tries to bring about self-regulation rather than a positive feedback which always tries to increase something. So I hope this is clear with respect to this particular diagram. So what I'm trying to say is that the basic idea is that organisms should try to maintain stability when it comes to their internal environment, despite the varying conditions of the external environment. We have to maintain the internal environment when compared to the external environment over here. So what we will do is we will see the different ways this can actually be done. So for our explanation, we'll take the example of unfavorable temperature. So I'm going to explain the different ways homeostasis can be achieved, but for our understanding, we will take the example of unfavorable temperature, meaning the external temperature is not suitable and we have to adapt to this particular external temperature by maintaining homeostasis over here. So then so what we are going to discuss is this: how do different animals cope with this unfavorable outside temperature? So we have four types, or we have four ways. One is regulation, one is conforming, the other is migration, and the last is suspension. So the first way of maintaining homeostasis is to regulate or regulation. Now this is what we have been discussing all the while. Very simple. Regulation is when this internal body's system is trying to regulate the internal temperature in accordance with the external environment. So birds, mammals, they're actually capable of something known as thermoregulation. Birds and mammals are capable of something known as thermoregulation. Now birds and mammals are actually endotherms. They are warm-blooded animals. They are also known as endotherms, and thermoregulation is capable. So birds and mammals are capable of thermoregulation, that is an internal mechanism to maintain the body temperature. So warm-blooded animals can increase or decrease heat loss by dilation of blood vessels or constriction of blood vessels respectively. Now this is what we have seen in the last slide before this. That is what I actually explained. What I had explained in the last slide was all about regulation, how we have stimulus in order to increase or decrease the temperature within the body in order to prevent the increase in temperature, at the same time to prevent heat loss. So this is what is going to happen. Either you can have constriction of blood vessels or you can have dilation of blood vessels with respect to whether you want to prevent heat loss or if you want more heat loss. So since warm-blooded animals are able to regulate, they are actually found in extreme conditions from the Antarctica to the Sahara Desert. See, for example, if you go to Antarctica, it is a very close, it is actually a very cold area. So therefore, if you don't have this mechanism known as thermoregulation, species may not be able to maintain internal temperature. That is why in such extremities, you usually have warm-blooded animals which are capable of thermoregulation, which are able to maintain this internal temperature. I'm explaining this with respect to temperature because I told you I'll go through all the different ways only with respect to temperature, but it is not restricted only to temperature. At the same time, it could also be with respect to behavior. It can also take up certain behavioral mechanisms. Say for example, in this particular image over here, just as we humans cool off, these you could call them monkeys for at this particular stage. These monkeys are actually cooling off. They're mostly apes. So these apes are actually cooling off in a water body, just as we humans are able to do. So this is a behavioral mechanism. At the same time, we can make use of the negative feedback loop to maintain the internal temperature. Next is conform. Now this is with respect to ectotherms, that is cold-blooded animals. Okay, so for this, obviously the best example is cold-blooded animals. Now they are not able to regulate their body temperature. They're not able to reduce their body temperature and hence depend on the outside environment in order to regulate their body temperature, like reptiles or amphibians. So If it is very hot outside, they will take shade under a tree or they will go underground. Say for example, take a snake or a lizard. If it is very hot outside, then they are not able to maintain their temperature through thermoregulation. They need external means. So what will the snake or the lizard do? The snake or the lizard will try to find shade. At the same time, if it is very cold outside, then they will prefer sunbathing. If it is very cold outside, they will prefer sunbathing because they are not able to prevent heat loss. So many animals have actually not evolved in order to incorporate thermoregulation. See, obviously, it would be better if you have evolved to incorporate thermoregulation because you have an internal mechanism itself. Why depend on something else? There a situation may arise where you're not able to find shade, for example. So why not have thermoregulation? Now, many species have actually not evolved to incorporate thermoregulation because this process of thermoregulation is very expensive in terms of energy. They need a lot of energy. Take very small animals, for example, like a hummingbird or a shrew. So what will happen is that they have a very large surface area relative to their volume, because of which they lose a lot of heat and would require a lot of energy to produce that heat through metabolism. This is why they do not have very small animals in the polar regions, because in order to maintain that internal temperature, they should be able to produce or generate that heat. But in order to generate that internal heat, you would have to spend a lot of energy. But these small animals are not able to spend so much of energy, use up so much of energy. That is the reason if you go to the polar regions, you will not find very small animals. Usually they are larger animals. This is because they do not have the ability to use up so much of energy in order to produce heat to maintain their body warm. So this is the second way. Then migration. This is very simple. Some animals migrate, like birds for example, in order to escape the winter cold. I'm pretty sure if you go to Ranganthittu, you should be able to see certain birds coming in all the way from Siberia to escape the winter cold, because here winter in India is very mild since we are very close to the equator. So migration is another way to ensure homeostasis. Now this is very simple. I'm pretty sure everybody understands migration. And at last we have suspension. Now this is also very simple. Suspension is to combat unfavorable temperature. What many animals do is that they will suspend their metabolic rate. Many animals will suspend their metabolic rate. For example, take a bear. I'm pretty sure you'd have heard of some animals going into hibernation. Yes. So what happens is that bears in cold regions, to avoid heat loss, go into hibernation, where the breathing rate, the heart rate, the metabolic rate, they all go down in order to prevent heat loss, conserve energy and conserve that heat within the body, so as to maintain homeostasis, because homeostasis is necessary for survival. So these are the different ways that homeostasis can be achieved within an organism. So this is with respect to the internal environment. So now coming back to our discussion with respect to the ecosystem itself. So the reason we are actually discussing homeostasis is because I've told you that the fourth function of an ecosystem is homeostasis. So coming back to this, some actually suggest that the ecosystem itself will function as a superorganism and therefore try to maintain homeostasis by actively modifying the environment to produce necessary environmental conditions required for stability or equilibrium. But what I want you to remember is that this equilibrium in an environment or in an ecosystem, this equilibrium is actually dynamic equilibrium, meaning continuous changes occur to maintain relatively uniform conditions. Now let me give you an example for this. Say in Bandipur, okay, say in Bandipur, the number of tigers actually increase. Then what will happen? They will kill and feed on more deers. The tigers will kill and feed on more deers. When more deers are consumed, their number reduces. Their number reduces. When the number of deers reduce, there is scarcity of food, and hence the number of tigers also reduce due to starvation. So now what? When the number of tigers reduce, the number of deers will increase. So after some time, the tigers will also start to increase in numbers. So more or less, the number of tigers and deers in Bandipur will remain constant on an average over a period of time. So don't you think Bandipur is actually maintaining this balance between tigers and deers? Don't you think this is homeostasis? This is what is the function of an ecosystem, always to maintain this balance. If this balance is not maintained, then the ecosystem may collapse. That is why we actually say that the ecosystem also has a way to maintain this stability or equilibrium. But this equilibrium is maintained through changes, the changes that I have just discussed over here. However, I also want you to remember the ability to maintain homeostasis is not unlimited in an ecosystem. It does not mean that no matter what happens, it will always be able to bring about this equilibrium. And we have seen that human intervention actually disrupts this system. So I hope you have actually understood the fourth function of an ecosystem. If you do have any doubts, please do write in the comment section. Thank you.